The News Project on GNAT-TV has been presenting a series of programs on the subject of what makes certain towns thrive while others merely survive, or what makes some resilient and others not. We started with a discussion with Daniel Herridges, the editor-in-chief for Strong Towns, a nonprofit media advocacy organization. We followed that with an interview with Jessica Martin, the executive director of Springfield on the Move, who talked about how that once formidable manufacturing town in Vermont has been rebuilding after several of their large employers closed up or moved away. More recently, we also talked with Ted Brady, the executive director of the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, and Lee Crone, who many viewers will remember from his days as the planning director for Manchester, and who is now the manager of the town of Shelburne, Vermont. We asked them both about what makes for resilient communities and also their thoughts on some contemporary questions, such as housing and climate change.
Well, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of books and research papers written on that topic. And I start by acknowledging something important, which is transition. And what's the difference between a struggling town and a thriving town? I think it is the towns are at different spots on a transition. In some cases, you could even say they're on different parts of kind of the grief process, right? This country went through a process where we were an agrarian country, where we became an industrialized country, and now we're converting, I think, into a tech economy. And that transition between each of those has been disruptive and hard, whether it be from agrarian to industrial, where we, may have accidentally poisoned, the water, literally, from industrial to tech. I think we're in, year probably 30 or 40 of that transition, globalization, name all these things. And it's just taken transition, I think. A lot of these communities are still in transition. So then you say, well, what makes them transition better? So I've read many of those books and many of those articles and scholarly research, and I really was struck by something that Thomas Friedman wrote about. Thomas Friedman wrote about something called complex adaptive coalitions. And what he did was he did some research of some of the communities across the country and said, well, what's making some of them pop? What's not making them pop? And he found it was about people, but it was about certain types of people. And that's an interesting thing. He said it's not necessarily those in power, people who are elected into leadership. It's unauthorized leadership. It's the small business owner down the street who took it upon himself to say, hey, let's meet at the McDonald's on Saturday mornings and talk about our town. Closer to home, look at, the food mafia, the food system mafia of Hardwick. A dozen people or so got together and started talking about what they wanted to do in Hardwick. They weren't people in elected office. They were people who'd come home to their town. So that's an interesting one. If you'll indulge me for my other research that I really look to and hold up as a great example, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston has been running something called the Working Communities Challenge here in Vermont. It has its foundation in something called the Working Cities Challenge in Southern New England. The Fed, a lot of people will know them for setting monetary policy. Maybe you know them for having a couple $1 billion in their basement. They also do a lot of research on community and economic development. They did a study of post-industrial cities around the country. Said, why have some emerged and thrived and others have not? And I can tell you they found out a couple things didn't matter. Industry mix, geographic location, size. Those were not the three contributing factors to success. The contributing factors to success were people. It was systems change. It was people working together to make something happen. That is hard, intense work. But to your question, I do believe the fundamental answer is the right mix of people collaborating and moving forward.
Have we learned anything about how we can manage this at this point? I mean, like I say, it's been 40, probably 50 years now since, factories and local mills started closing because it was cheaper to import stuff, or move the factory down to South Carolina or something like that. Uh, but has there been any sense that, well, we either need to retrain workers and have a much bigger program along those lines, or do something to kind of just sort of.
Yeah, I just don't think it's that simple. There are plenty of federal programs. The EDA runs, trade adjustment assistance programs that can come in and retrain workers after a plant shutters. There are plenty of those programs out there. There are economists that do this kind of work. There are, international programs. But we in Vermont see a different story, right? When you look around our communities, there are major employers still manufacturing things in Vermont. So why? I can't answer that question other than they have become very good at doing something. They've found a skilled workforce. They've found a niche. A lot of places it's value added manufacturing. It's not commodity manufacturing. Why are some of these succeeding? Look into the Upper Valley in New Hampshire and Vermont, where Hypertherm employs hundreds of people doing plasma, cutting and different types of manufacturing. Somehow there's still a chip plant in northern Vermont that employs 2,000 people and another 1,000 contractors that's making, the smartphone chips, the chips that are in every phone in the world. And they just announced another major investment up there. Look in Rutland, where they're, making aircraft engines in North Clarendon and Rutland. Why can that still happen if globalization has cracked and broken the backs of the industrial base in the country? I'm not sure, but it's happening still. So I don't subscribe to the, all manufacturing is leaving America and leaving Vermont. I do think, though, that that's not the only solution to a thriving, successful downtown anymore, and to a thriving community. You could have remote workers in your community. You could have the new ag economy in your community. Who knows what cannabis will do for economic development in Vermont. You have, speaking of mind-altering substances, you have a beer and wine culture in Vermont that employs hundreds of people that didn't exist a decade and a half ago. So it's not, globalization hasn't broken the back. I want to go back to what I said. It has caused and required a transition.
What about things like proximity to airports, or having a college in town, or maybe being near to some sort of natural resource? Are those factors as well?
Yeah, I think they can be. I maybe you've heard me talk about this before, Andrew. I think
Right.
back to so I've now quoted Thomas Friedman, the Boston Fed, and now I'm going to quote Billy Crystal. Or I
All
should say
right.
a film Billy Crystal was in. Do you remember the show City Slickers? And Billy Crystal and his buddies go out to a dude ranch, and they go on this adventure, midlife crisis, and they run into Curly, I think was his name, who was played by, I think it's Jack Palance, old crusty cowboy. I'm probably getting his name wrong. And they're riding on horses across the desert, or across whatever background that is where you drive cattle. Probably not the desert. That wouldn't make sense. And the cowboys talking to Billy Crystal's character, and they're trying to talk about like what the meaning of life is. And cowboy looks at him and says, "It's one thing." Billy Crystal goes, "Well, what is it?" Like, "Well, that's your job to find out." And I truly believe that's part of community and economic development. A community that has a college, yeah, that might be their one thing. A community that has, thousands of acres of rolling hillside that's great agriculture, that might be their one thing. A community that has the best mountain bike trail network, or the possibility, that might be their one thing. And it doesn't need to be one thing. Don't get me wrong, it can be a mix, but I don't think you need to be near an airport to succeed. If you're near an airport, you're likely going to have advantages in certain industries. If you have a land grant university in your community, you're likely going to have some advantages. But I don't think that's it. I don't think that's the magic. You don't need those things to be successful. You need to figure out that one thing. I feel like I'm filibustering, but I have to point to something that the state of Vermont's doing now that's really incredible and kind of feeds this narrative. The Agency of Commerce and Community Development launched a program called the Better Places Program. And the Better Places Program provides a grant match to a capital campaign in your community to create better places, to put in art installations, to have events, to spruce up your town green, improve the park. Go down a long list. And so, a lot of people are doing these crowdfunding campaigns right now. And this Better Places program, which the legislature funded, allows communities to identify something in their town they want to do and rally people around it, do a crowdfunding campaign, and then the state of Vermont is matching whatever you raise in that crowdfunding campaign, I think up to $40,000. So it's a really neat program. It's accessible to just about every community in the state, and it might help them find their one thing. It's meant to, put a little injection in the arms of people. I also think that, it's a little bit of psychologic operations by the government to try to get people to think differently about their community. So I want to go back to the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. The Working Communities Challenge, which I mentioned before, launched in Vermont 3 years ago, just before the pandemic. And it challenged communities to come up with a common problem that they want to solve in community and economic development. And the Fed, public-private partnership, the state put money in, the Feds put money in, philanthropy put money in. The Fed is now funding 8 projects around the state where they're funding capacity of people, so $300,000 to $400,000 grants for a multi-year project to, in the Upper Valley, they're talking about create more workforce housing. In the Barrie and Greater Capital Area, they're talking about trying to get single head of household families out of poverty and get them jobs. I believe in southeastern Vermont, they're talking about bringing refugees and new Americans into the community and providing them with job skills and life skills to try to get them acclimated into the community and allow them to thrive and contribute to the community, recognizing the workforce shortage. These things are not funding bridges, they're not funding water systems, they're not funding broadband, they're funding people and trying to get people to think differently and to create systems change where you bring in the anchor institutions of your community, the hospital, the university, the employer, as well as the town, but also going back to that Thomas Friedman concept, some unauthorized leadership. People that simply want to be leaders and have ideas but are not elected or have a longer staying course than elected officials.
After our conversation with Mr. Brady, we moved on to 2 conversations with Lee Crone, the former planning director of Manchester until 2013. After his 24 years of work in various municipal offices in Manchester, which included interim town manager, planning director, zoning administrator, tree warden, and E911 coordinator, he became a senior planner at the Chittenden Regional Planning Commission, before moving on to become Shelburne's town manager in 2018. I mean, what do you think makes for a strong, resilient town? I mean, what are some of the elements that come to your mind when you think of this community seems to have its act together, whereas the one over yonder, not so much?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think there are several dimensions to that. I think it certainly helps if a community has some kind of built or natural attractions that give it sort of a foundation, whether it's historic architecture or proximity to mountains or water. I mean, those things certainly help. But they're not, I think they're helpful, but not, definitive on their own. I think a huge part of what makes communities successful is that people care about the place. and they are willing to volunteer and be helpful in strengthening social connections, community connections, willing to step up and help good things happen. And I think it helps it be even stronger when people are willing to look beyond their own particular silo interest toward a more holistic, synergistic approach to things. So that, like right now, here in Shelburne, we have a blizzard of committees, and they all live in their own little silos, and they don't care a whit about the other interests. And I've been trying to help break down those silos since the day I arrived. So that, for example, you have a natural resources committee and they just want to conserve land just to prevent development. But they don't think about it in terms of wildlife corridors or contiguity or bike ped connections that might be a part of those land conservation projects. You know, when I did all those land conservation projects in Manchester, public access was a key element in every single one. It wasn't just to lock up land to create a museum of protected parcels. It was to help create places that people could also enjoy without harming the resource. So Ivan Beatty's land, you know, it's ag land, but we reserved a corridor around the boundary so people could walk and enjoy. But anyway, so I think people caring about and creating a sense of place and strengthening a sense of place, whether it's community festivals or events or farmers markets or caring about architectural design in the heart of a historic downtown so that you maintain and strengthen the fabric of what made a place to begin with. And finding a balance between those things and helping a local economy thrive so that people are willing to support each other financially and economically as well as socially.
What do you think is the role that local leadership plays?
Local leadership has an important role in setting a tone and being able and willing, having the courage to make decisions not necessarily just for short-term perceived or actual gain, but for long-term value and benefit. Not all your constituents will understand that long-term view. So, for example, some might suggest that having strong land use regulations is harmful to the business community, makes it harder for people to do business. But if you set up a system that's really smart, it will realize that it might make it a little harder in the short run, but strengthens things in the long run. I mean, one thing Ivan Beatty always used to say in Manchester was, it's okay to have high standards, but the system should be predictable. So we held firm to architectural design and site plan design and all those things that make a difference in the long run. But it shouldn't be hard for its own sake. It should be hard because you care about what things look like and how interconnections work and how the look and feel of a town will be 20, 30, 50, 100 years from now. Are you letting people build buildings that whatever they want to build, cinder blocks and aluminum siding? Or are you pressing hard for architectural design that will stand the test of time and live beyond its current use? Those can be hard decisions to make, but they are where leadership sets the tone for what matters in a town. Do you have places for people to gather? Do you have a park that's just an open blank canvas? Or do you have a park that makes it clear that there are attractive elements to it? There's a gazebo, or there's a path, or there's an informational historic sign, or something, or a bike rack. Things that help make it feel like a place to be, rather than just open space for its own sake. But that's where leadership steps in. And, you know, is a community willing to reinvest in itself? So it's not just saying we want the private sector to spend all this money to do all these nice things, but is the town also willing to step up and do those things too?
Mm.
So
Yeah. So anyway, I was trying to think, kind of where we left off there the other day, and I was just thinking. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was if you're seeing any kind of broad trends emerging in like town planning. I guess this is going to take you back to your planning director days down here and all that. But what makes walkability and bikeability such a desirable thing? I mean, realize that sounds like a pretty obvious question, perhaps, but there seems to be
Well,
so much emphasis on it. I wonder, what's the value added to that?
well, they're all good questions. And I never really abandoned my planning hat because I've had to still be involved in that. Actually, during a fairly lengthy staffing transition, I had to pick back up and run with the Planning Commission and help guide them through we made some dramatic progress. But anyway, I am seeing some trends in the planning universe, and some of them appear to be tending toward the concept of overhauling zoning regulations so they are hopefully somewhat simpler to navigate and more sensibly goal oriented. So often zoning regulations end up being these discussions about rules, but nobody's really clear about or thinks about what the rule is intended to accomplish. Why do we have the rule, and is it necessary at all? So, for example, planning commissions end up in these long debates sometimes about should the setback between X and Y be 10 or 20 feet? Well, the real question first needs to be, what's the purpose of the setback? Because if you're just debating numbers in a vacuum, what's the point? Because sometimes 0 might be the right answer, and sometimes infinite might be the right answer. Depends on what the issue is. With regard to, so I'm seeing a little more emphasis on overhauling bylaws, which I think is really long overdue. We need to do it here for sure. And I know the state has issued now, I think they're going to issue a second round of what they're calling bylaw modernization grants, trying to get things up to speed to current times and not just living in this constantly copying of everyone else's bylaws from somewhere else without really knowing why you're doing it. And bikeability and walkability end up entering into that as part of this whole strong town conversation, because if you can make a community more pedestrian friendly or more bicycle friendly, number one, maybe you help reduce some car trips. So get a few cars off the road, reduce a little carbon and emissions. That's a good thing. The more people feel comfortable walking or biking through their communities, the more likely there can be greater level of social interaction. You know, I was just out in our front sidewalk for a little while, taking a picture of a new giant pencil sculpture in front of our library. And I ended up in a conversation with the director of the Shelburne Museum and the director of the library. It happened because there was a place and an attraction and a reason to be out in public on the sidewalk. So that's just a microcosm of those things. You know, a lot of towns have farmers markets, whether it's Saturday morning, Thursday afternoon. If you can park and walk there, if you can ride your bike there, again, another opportunity for social interaction and strengthening of social bonds and community bonds. And it leads to conversations about things that don't have to be just about what's on somebody's meeting agenda. So it's one small piece of this larger puzzle of strengthening community writ large. And I think that's why the bikeability and the walkability is so important. It's also related to healthier lifestyles and, again, carbon reduction and, you know, fewer cars on the road and the noise that entails and all the rest. So it's a multidimensional thing that can be synergistically helping to create multiple positive outcomes.
Interesting. So the other big thing I wanted to ask you about, and what you're seeing is of course, a question that seems to be dominating state politics and discussions, has been for a while, pre-pandemic and all that, is housing. Why, I guess the fundamental question I've been thinking about is, why is it so hard to build, affordable or workforce or missing middle housing in Vermont?
I think, again, there's probably multiple reasons or thoughts about that. I mean, Where I used to live on Carlin Street, that was a classic little neighborhood that was reasonably affordable for normal working people. Um, why did it get so hard to build those things? I think one reason is people have become more activist in the zoning arena. And once they have their little piece of the pie, they don't want to see anybody else's houses. I mean, we have these constant dramas and arguments over whether, the solar panel thing is a classic metaphor. I'm all in favor of renewable energy, just put it somewhere else. I'm all in favor of, call it what we will, affordable housing, just don't put it near me. And those pressures have exacerbated over time, along with zoning rules that become ever more restrictive, along with notions that, these implicit notions that, one way you create more cost-effective housing is that terrible buzzword density. It's easier and cheaper to build a multifamily structure than a whole bunch of separate single-family homes. But we adopt these density rules that either limit that or prevent that. We have the social activism of opposing things in the zoning arena. And then you layer in perceptions or realities of, between you and me, we can say those kind of people, and it's going to cause trouble. And I don't want it, I don't need it. And yet, in some places, it's working. I mean, Winooski completely overhauled their rules, and they're seeing all sorts of multi-story, high-rise, high-density housing projects in the core. Burlington's had a few. If you tried to build one of those in Shelburne, I think it would cause World War III. If it were even legal. We have a high-density housing project sort of floating around on the books right now, and the neighbors are just completely apoplectic about it. Then you layer in the cost of materials. And this is not necessarily a new issue, although it's obviously been dramatically exacerbated in the last couple of years. I mean, I remember when I was reviewing my insurance policy, this goes back now, how long have I been up here? Since almost 10 years. So this is going back at least 15 years, and reviewing the insurance policy for my very modest little 1.5-story Cape. And Craig Powers told me that I should be carrying replacement insurance in the order of $180,000. If that house burnt to the ground, what would it cost to rebuild it? Now that presumes I still own the land, I still have water, I still have power, and I still have a septic system in the ground. That's just to rebuild the house. It was about an 1,100 square foot, very modest level of construction. So this cost thing is not a new issue, but it's way worse now than it was. Then you layer into it, Vermont's a very attractive place to be and has been for a long time. So people with means can afford to drive up the price structure. And again, this is not a new issue, although it's hugely exacerbated. I mean, look at Manchester. It was an expensive place to buy a home for a long, long time. When the Chamber of Commerce did a survey, this is going back 20, 25 years. The three biggest issues were housing cost, transportation, and daycare. And fast forward today, I'm sure those are identical.
We'll be continuing this series soon with a look at how other communities negotiate the transition from one phase to another. For the GNAT-TV News Project, I'm Andrew McKeever.